Hi, my name is Amanda Sears, and I'm the horticulture agent here at the Madison County Extension Office. And just want to talk to you a little bit about container gardening today. A lot of times when we think of container gardening, we automatically think of growing flowers, something decorative, but you can actually also grow fruit, vegetables, and herbs. With containers, the first thing to think of is, well, what kind of container do you want to have? And pretty much anything can be used as a container, in my mind, as long as it meets a little bit of criteria. The first big thing, though, is drainage holes. Does it have the ability to drain? There are a lot of different types of containers out there, though, and they all have pros and cons. Plastics and fiberglass tend to be more lightweight, probably less expensive, but may not hold up over time as well. Clay and ceramics are heavy and porous. Wood, I think of more as in a raised bed. Metal can be very decorative and beautiful, expensive, but I think also it can heat up a lot easier than the others if we do have hot weather. And I've always liked this picture to the right of a man who is gardening in kiddie pools, and I think that's just a great example of thinking outside the box and not being limited by how we think we need to view gardening. A couple other things to think about. You want to avoid black or dark colored containers in a sunny location, because those or not just sunny, but a warm sunny location, especially on those hot days in summer when that could actually heat up the root ball within the media and cause damage. I also want to protect the root zone from cold temperatures in the winter. I have known people to grow fig trees in very, very large containers, which don't always overwinter well here in Kentucky. So what the owner would have to do is bring the fig out in the summer and take it back out home in the late fall and winter. Something I already mentioned, metal containers do get hot. Make sure the plant matches the container itself in terms of size. The picture to the right, the tomato plant is pretty tall in a container that's not very big. And so I don't know long term if that's going to work real well. My fear is if a wind came through, it would easily knock over the plant because there's so much material above the pot. Be sure the containers are big enough, and of course this varies according to the chosen plant. For herbs, smaller or not as deep container would work, 6 to 8 inches. For most vegetables, you want something that's deeper, at least 8 to 10 inches. For some things like tomato, it would actually require something deeper than that. I think the most important thing in my mind when it comes to container gardening is drainage. I think that's kind of the place where people often skip, and they don't. And what happens is then they overwater, or we get a lot of rain, and then the roots end up staying wet too long, and they end up rotting. So make sure to have 1/4-inch drainage holes every 2 to 3 inches apart. You don't want them to stay too wet, so we'll talk about irrigating a little bit later. Be careful with attached saucers. A lot of times those kind of lock into place, and I think if they're on there really tight, it can block the drainage holes. If your drainage holes are on the bottom and it's sitting very flush with a surface, you might want to consider elevating the container so that the drainage holes aren't blocked. It's also a myth that putting gravel in the bottom of your container actually helps. And I think that's something, I've been told since I was a child, and I think a lot of people believe, but it can actually negatively affect how water flows through the container. And I put on there a website, but if you just want to look on the internet at garden myths and maybe garden myths gravel at the bottom of the pot, there's some really good information there. So the big takeaway on this is drainage is extremely important, and I think that's one thing people often lack. Clean containers is really important if you're reusing your container from year to year. One way, and we talked about this a lot with gardening, one way that diseases spread from year to year is by plant material staying in the same spot. So, you know, if you had geraniums in a pot and your geraniums were sick last year and you leave that soil in there and a little bit of plant material left over, that same disease could easily reinfect the geraniums this year. Also, you might want to remove any salt buildup around the rim of the container, and you can do that by making a paste out of baking soda and water, allowing that to sit on the salt and then scraping it off, or you can use a knife. To disinfect the pots, soak the containers in a solution of 1 part household bleach with 9 parts water for at least 30 minutes. And once those are soaked, then rinse them and allow them to dry. So I think I've already said the word media a few times because what we're putting in our containers to grow our plants isn't considered soil. It's not from the garden, it's not from our lawns. We do not use soil from the yard or garden in our containers, because if we were to move that, it would be very dense. And because of the way plants grow in containers, we want it to be more porous and lightweight. So potting soil is often recommended in these cases, and it's blended to hold moisture while also allowing excess moisture to drain away. So it kind of creates a balance. But the word we use there instead of soil or dirt is media. And I'm a very frugal person, and so I hate the thought of having to buy something that's not needed. But if you are growing things in containers every year, it is best to use fresh potting soil each year. And I already mentioned the disease problems, but the structure of potting media tends to break down over time, and so the quality will go down over time as well. And so when we are growing perennials, oftentimes we do need to take them out and divide them. And so in those cases, you know, I would divide it, but then I would also probably put some new potting soil back into the new container that I'm putting the perennials in. This is just a table. It's actually from the Home Vegetable Gardening Guide from Kentucky, from the University of Kentucky. This obviously is just vegetables, but it just shows some good information, I think, in terms of how big a container is needed for each type of plant. You can see something like lettuce. You can grow 2 plants per 1 gallon, but then if you have something like a tomato, you actually need literally a 5-gallon size bucket in order to grow 1 plant. It also shows that some varieties grow better in smaller containers. Going back to that tomato, you know, you probably wouldn't want to grow a big boy in a container garden, but there are some that could be considered pixie or tiny Tim, toy boy, something that's a little bit more compact. And the same is true if you're trying to look at maybe squash or cucumber. Rather than trying to grow a trellising type, I would probably look at the more bush varieties. I think those would be more compact and grow a little better. Herbs do grow really well in container gardens. Some grow a little better than others. You know, I've got a little list there. It's by no means all the herbs that grow well in containers, but parsley, sage, cilantro, thyme, oregano, the mints, rosemary, and basil, and chives. And you know, mints, I think, are interesting because they grow so prolifically that a lot of times gardeners will even put them into containers if they're putting them in the ground. Like they'll bury the container in the ground so that they won't escape. One thing to consider when you are growing herbs is to pinch the plants during the growing season to keep them bushy and compact. And you can see on the right-hand side, someone is pinching a basil plant, and that's going to help the plant to stay smaller and bushier. You plant into container gardens pretty much like you would plant into any other garden. You do want to moisten the soil mix before planting and fill the container with soil up to 1/2 inch from the top. And if you're using seeds, just follow the directions on the packet. But if you're transplanting using plants, you want to put them in there even with the soil like you would in any garden. But one thing to consider is I don't think I'd put plants actually touching the edge of the pot or the container, because depending on the container, that could heat up and that could hurt that plant. Sun requirements. For most fruit and vegetable crops, just like with any other garden, they do require at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. But things like leafy crops, root crops, and a lot of herbs can actually grow with much less light. So that's good if you aren't in an especially sunny location. That can help you maybe to have a garden, maybe not a conventional garden, where you'd be growing tomatoes, but maybe you could at least grow herbs or lettuce. Fertilizing. Many potting soils actually contain fertilizer. And so it may be, if you're using one of those types of potting soil, you may not even need to add any fertilizer through the season. But however, frequent watering can lead to nutrients leaching out. And so how do you know if it's time to fertilize? Well, you need to observe the plants to see if they're growing well. And a couple ways to do that is, are they growing at a rate that you think is appropriate? And then, is the color good? If plants are nutrient deficient, oftentimes they will look pale in color, and so that would be a good indication. I didn't mention this on the last slide, and I just thought of it, but if your plants are very spindly and tall, that's actually an indication that you're not getting enough light. So that question comes up quite a bit. If you are planning on fertilizing, I would probably use a water-soluble fertilizer that's even slow release. I think that would be easier to apply to containers than a more granular type fertilizer. Something to keep in mind, container gardens tend to dry out much quicker than if they were a garden that was planted in the ground. And so how do you know when you need to water? Well, if you could put your finger down in the soil, if the first inch of soil is dry, it's time to irrigate. And that's going to be different for every container and combination of plants. Some containers are going to dry out much more quickly than other types. So it'll just take a little practice to figure that out. And also, some plants are much heavier drinkers than others. So I think by just kind of observing and doing a little experimenting, you'll be able to find a good balance. You want to make sure and water until the entire root ball is wet. And so you're going to water actually until water starts to come out the drain hole in the bottom. And that's how you'll know that the inside of the pot is completely saturated. Not only is this good for the root system and the whole plant, but this also can help cut down on salt buildup. If you go a little too long without watering and your media gets really dry, it can sometimes actually start to separate from the pot. And when that does happen, it can often be hard to adequately water. And so what you need to do is to put the container in a bucket or your sink or a tub with water and allow it to be up to the surface of the actual container, and allow the media to be moistened through the drainage holes. And so hopefully that will help the media to expand back out and close that gap. So I just want to touch on raised beds for a second. I get a lot of questions about them. And really I consider raised beds to just really be a type of container sitting on the ground with no bottom. Some pros to raised beds, and I talk to a lot of people here in Madison County who don't have the best soils for one reason or another, mostly because they have a lot of clay and drainage is a problem. So one big pro of raised beds is they do have better drainage. They warm up faster in the spring, which is good, because a lot of times plants don't really start to grow until the soil temperature gets to be a certain point. And they're elevated, so if you are having problems such as you have a bad back maybe, you don't have to stoop down as much on the ground as with a conventional garden. You can actually elevate the raised bed. One con of raised bed gardening is that it does dry out faster than a garden that's in the ground. Not as fast, however, as a container, like a smaller container would. UK does have a really good gardening pub that mentions raised beds, called Gardening in Small Spaces, and I've got the link there, or you can just go on the internet and look for Gardening in Small Spaces. You could put in University of Kentucky and that should come up. In general, you do not want to make your raised bed any wider than you are able to reach across. Usually people don't make them any more than 4 feet across because the idea is you never want to have to stand in the bed. So at any given time you should be able to reach to the center of the bed. Height of bed depends on what you're growing, but I'd make it at least 6 to 8 inches tall, and I also wouldn't put anything on the bottom as a barrier to the ground. The reason being, let's say you're planting a tomato plant in there, or potatoes, or something that may have a larger root system than something like lettuce. If the root system ends up needing to be bigger than that 6 to 8 inches or whatever it was the height that you made your bed, I would want the plant to be able to put its root system into the ground beneath the raised bed. Oftentimes raised beds are made from wood. That's kind of what we usually think of, but you can also use masonry or other building materials. I would avoid treated wood if possible, especially things like railroad ties. There's a lot of research out there that shows that the leaching effects from the wood is minimal, and some studies that show it's something that needs to be considered. So make sure that you're comfortable with whatever you are using to build your raised bed. And if you have questions about that later, feel free to contact me and we can talk about it. I also recommend using some native soil when you're creating your bed. And I think that surprises people because that's the very thing we're trying to avoid. But I would probably mix the native soil with an organic matter such as compost or peat moss. And I would do a ratio would be 1 to 1 or 1 to 2. And I think native soil is important because it helps with drainage. I mentioned earlier with the garden myth about the gravel at the bottom of the container. And this is kind of similar. You know, if you're taking very good soil, very porous media, and then it's going straight into a very heavy clay, it's not going to drain as well as if you have maybe mixed in that native soil and created a more common pore space. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. During this age of social distancing, email might be the best way to get a hold of me. My email address is amanda.sears@uky.edu, or call our office at 859-623-4072. So until I see you again, be sure and stay healthy.